Okay, we are going to get started. So again, thank you so much for coming to the Conservation Education Lunch and Learn series. Today, I'm so excited to introduce our expert speaker. Her name is Dr. Martha Durr. She's a professor of applied climate science in the School of Natural Resources at UNL, and she's been a faculty member since 2009. Her work focuses on climate variability and change and understanding climate impacts. She spent 7 years at the Alaska Climate Research Center and 6 years as director of the NOAA High Plains Regional Climate Center, and has also served as the Nebraska State Climatologist, directing the Nebraska State Climate Office since 2016. Her research has taken her from remote Alaska villages to the windswept Nebraska Sandhills. She also was a co-author on the 2018 U.S. National Climate Assessment, and you can find her weather column at the NEBRASKAland magazine. So we're so excited to have her on today. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, I will be the moderator today. So if you have them, feel free to put them in the chat. There might be some times throughout her presentation where we'll kind of stop and answer a few, but we'll definitely try to leave time at the end for all your valuable questions. With that, Martha, you could go ahead and take it from here, and thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Amber. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you. So thanks for allowing me into your lunch hour here. So in my role as state climatologist, I get the opportunity to talk to a lot of people and groups and agencies about climate change and all kinds of climate issues, in fact, past, present, as well as future. So I'll just begin by talking a little bit about what I mean by local climate services. Each state in the country does have a state climatologist. So I have counterparts all across the US. I used to work at the Alaska State Climate Office. And so it's interesting comparing the issues between Alaska and here in Nebraska. So as Amber mentioned, I've been in this role this is my 7th year. We're a relatively small office. We're housed in the School of Natural Resources at the university. So just down the road, in fact, a block away from the Game and Parks office here in Lincoln. We focus our efforts on climate monitoring. We have 56 weather stations around the state of Nebraska. The one you see here is one of our newest stations way in southwest Nebraska in Dundee County that is near the community of Enders. So a lot of our effort is focused on monitoring our environment. We engage a lot with various stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier. So that could be a city or community, it could be a state agency, it could be a natural resource district, or groups like this one. So we engage quite a bit with the community, and essentially what we like to do is develop decision support tools and help people understand what climate information is available and help them make it, turn it from useful to usable and some sort of decision support. And increasingly, we get asked about the topic of climate change. What you're seeing here is I'll be showing more of these images, but it's a climate projection in the next, our climate normals a few decades into the future are going to be different than what they are now because of climate change. So we work a lot in the space of helping people understand these climate projections. So that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today, is what do the most recent climate model projections tell us about what our climate's going to be like in Nebraska and elsewhere, and how do people feel about the topic of climate change? You have your own perception, maybe the community or where you work has its own perceptions of climate change. So I'll give you a kind of my perspective on how people feel about this topic. So I do teach a 100 level class, an introduction to climate change here at UNL, where we talk about the science of climate change, the symptoms and the solutions. And this is a slide that I kind of start with at the beginning of the semester. I talk about it throughout the class and end with it. And I include it in a lot of the talks that I give. And climate change is something that can be very difficult to kind of wrap your head around and understand what does it mean for us locally. And so I essentially boil it down to these 5 key messages. The fact that it's real and it's here now. We're not waiting for climate change to happen. It's not just the polar bear on the ice floe. It's something like the flood of 2019, like you see in the background, or it's the derecho event in the warm December that we had last year, or it's the wind events that we had earlier in the spring, or heavy rain events. We are feeling climate change right now. Some people feel those impacts much stronger and are more difficult to cope than others. And climate change is disproportional. So certain populations are more vulnerable and they feel these impacts more strongly. Humans are the cause of climate change, but we're also the solution. So we're the problem, but we're also the solution. The fact that we must act now, the sooner we act, the less risky it will be and the less severe impacts that we will feel from climate change. And something I'll touch on towards the end of the talk here is how to talk to people about climate change and connecting with common values. So how do we assess the state of our climate? There's lots of reports that come out. You may have heard about the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They had their 6th assessment report come out late last year. These are regular assessments, and there's this very large scientific body that comes together and looks at what do the latest models say, what are the implications, what are the solutions, kind of all these different aspects of climate change. And there's the URL if you want to dive deep into the details. A similar assessment happens at the US scale. So Amber mentioned that I was one of the many co-authors on the US National Climate Assessment. The most recent one came out in 2018. That's the URL that you see there. It focuses on different regions in the country as well as different sectors in the country, such as ecosystems and ecosystem services, water, agriculture, indigenous peoples. So there's different ways that we can assess climate change. So there's a good resource there, and this does have a regular update. So the next one will be coming out next year. The images that I'm going to show in this presentation come from primarily from these 2 assessments. So since this is being hosted by the Game and Parks Commission, I thought that I would start out with thinking about how these indicators of climate change and the fact that ecosystems are all impacted in some sort of way, some ecosystems more and stronger than other ecosystems. So this quote here is something that I pulled from the climate assessment. So all regions and ecosystems are experiencing the impacts of climate change. This image happens to be an interactive one. So if you go on the National Climate Assessment, you can look at temperature and how that is changing over time. The fact that heat waves are increasing, precipitation is getting heavier. Snowpack is declining overall in the Western US, and it's melting earlier. And there's less snow when it does melt. There's increasing wildfire activity, and I'll touch on wildfires a bit later in the presentation. The growing season is lengthening. There's a difference in heating and cooling degree days. Those are changing. Drought conditions are changing. So we have these different indicators and ways that we know that, yes, things are changing. So in addition to the temperature trends that we see, all these thermometers that we have around the globe, we have these various indicators of how we can track climate change over time. And just a couple of comments on ecosystems and climate change. Again, this one comes specifically from the ecosystems chapter. There are key messages that are pointed out that the authors highlight as being the most important things to think about. So climate change is altering ecosystem productivity, exacerbating the spread of invasive species, and changing how species interact with each other and with their environment. These changes are reconfiguring ecosystems in unprecedented ways. So you may easily think of examples maybe from your area of interest or your work or where you live. But things are changing at rates that we just haven't seen before, have not documented before. When it comes to management of natural resources, traditional strategies are increasingly challenged by the impacts of climate change. Adaptation strategies that are flexible consider those interacting impacts of climate as well as other stressors and are coordinated across a landscape are progressing from theory to application. So thinking about different ways in which we deal with these changes and adapt to climate change and strategies that are flexible and nimble and can shift as the conditions shift are things that we also need to think about. In a very broad brush sense, we can think about the climate of the US, the fact, and this applies to Nebraska, the warming is ramping up, especially at night. Our nighttime lows are warming up about twice as fast as our daytime high temperatures are. So the speed of things is increasing. Heat events are increasing. And again, think of both daytime high temperatures as well as nighttime low temperatures. The number of days above these high temperature thresholds are increasing. The precipitation amount as well as intensity is increasing. The image that you see here, this one, it happens to be taken from the EPA. They do have some good resources that track these climate indicators. So this is in a historical sense, and you can see where the dark green color of the US, it's right in the middle of the country as well as the northeast part of the US. That's where the highest and greatest changes in precipitation are taking place. So you can see in Nebraska and some of the other Great Plains states, when you get further west in the high plains, that's when we're seeing a decline in precipitation. So there is regional variability in some of these rates of change and indicators of climate change. The weather is getting more variable and more extreme. That was definitely something that I recognized within the last 12 months. I don't know how many media requests I got about the wind, the derecho, the lack of water, the heavy precipitation, just all these extreme events coming at us one after the other. So weather is a major way in which we feel climate change, right? So weather is the day-to-day and climate is the collection of all those weather events. So if your climate is shifting, your weather events and the type and the frequency is also shifting. So that was our past. Our climate future, that is what's up to us. We get to determine, dictate what our climate future looks like. This is all based on greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. So if we think about the global average temperature, this dark gray curve here, that's how we've changed in the past. So the Earth has warmed up about 1.5 degrees, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 150 years, which is about the rate of Nebraska, how much we have warmed. So notice that our scenarios is we can do nothing, which is that RCP 8.5, some of you may have seen these letters and numbers. What that means is representative concentration pathway. And it's giving us an amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are sitting in the atmosphere. Okay, the higher those go, the higher our global average temperature is. So the 8.5 is the orange curve, and then the 4.5, that is we act now. We put mitigative action into place with starting now and in the coming decades to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When that happens, then our temperature increase is much, much less. Okay. So a couple things that I wanted to point out, and if you just look at kind of the slope of those two arrows, so the historical trend, again, I mentioned about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. If we put mitigation into place, we're kind of going along that same rate of change. Okay, it's changing at about the same speed. If we don't put mitigative action into place, notice the steepness of that orange curve. So things will just keep warming and we won't stabilize if we keep on this business as usual approach. Okay, so what does that mean? If I give you a global average temperature, how does that relate to us here in Nebraska? So I'm giving you two scenarios, and this is model output from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that 6th assessment that just came out less than a year ago. What do our worlds look like? So the one on the left is no mitigation, and the one on the right is mitigation action into place. So what you'll note right offhand is the color difference here. So I just kind of extracted, what does it mean for Lincoln, Nebraska? With no mitigation, our average summer high will be over 100. If we put mitigation into place, then it'll be a more tolerable 95 degrees, which is still warmer than our average summer temperature is now, but it's much more tolerable and less impactful. So these are just to put some numbers on what these climate models would actually mean. Okay. So I'm just going to compare an average annual temperature, and we'll focus on different parts of the world here. This one is for just a few decades out into the future. So I should have mentioned the previous graphics were for the end of the century. Okay, so this one focuses just on a couple decades into the future. What will be our average annual temperature compared to what it is right now? So Lincoln, Nebraska will be about 5.5 degrees warmer, and that's true for much of the central US, in fact. So if we translate that, that is like current day Wichita, Kansas. Okay, so that's kind of how our climate will shift. And this assumes mitigation is put into place. Okay. Across the Arctic, you'll see that there's really strong warming, 11 degrees warmer across the Arctic. The reason for that is something I brought up on an earlier slide. When we remove ice and snow in the Arctic, we absorb a lot more energy. Okay, snow and ice is very reflective. Right? If you've ever been skiing in the wintertime and it's a sunny day, you need sunglasses because it's very, when the sunlight hits the snow, it's very reflective. So when you remove that highly reflective surface, when that melts, then you've got open ocean, it's dark, and it absorbs a lot more energy. So that's why the high Arctic is much, much warmer. So that was temperature. Let's look at precipitation here. So we'll think about, again, a few decades into the future, our average annual precipitation. In general, climates that are wet will get wetter, and climates that are dry will get drier. You can see some diagonal lines here on this image. What that means is there is less agreement in the model output. We didn't see that in the previous map that was temperature. So there's higher agreement in the model output. Precipitation is a variable that is more difficult to accurately predict. So there's a range in what these model projections are saying for precipitation. That's why it's those lines are there that's signifying a lower model agreement. In general, the model average is looking at about 12% wetter for the central US. So for Lincoln, that bumps us up maybe a few inches on average. what I think is more important or more interesting is if we look not on an annual basis, but on a monthly and seasonal basis, because we do see differences based on time of year. So when and how we get our precipitation, that is projected to change in a warmer world. So this image I'm going to show is a little bit complicated. There's a lot on this slide here. So again, this is looking, this is our current climate, and then our future climate is on kind of the right-hand side of the screen. So it's all relative to what our current normal is like. So if we just focus kind of on middle of the century, a few decades into the future, we're looking at more precipitation, about 15% more during the winter and spring. So when it's colder, we're likely to get more precipitation. When it's warmer during the summer months, our precipitation will be less on average than what it is right now. So thinking of what some implications of this difference in this precipitation trend. So during our hot time of year, during the growing season, water is being utilized more. There's going to be more of a demand for water because it's going to be warmer, but there will generally be less precipitation. So more of it will fall during that colder time of year. And then one other aspect that I wanted to cover with regard to our climate future, thinking about variability, and we already live in a very highly variable climate, right? We're in the middle of the North American continent. We go quickly from one extreme to another. Often I'll call Nebraska the climate crossroads because it's generally wet to our east, it's dry to our west, and where we are in Nebraska can move, we can be wetter, or we can be drier. It just depends on kind of the track of storms and where the jet stream is and those kinds of factors. So we're already in a variable climate that does have a lot of extremes. So thinking about some recent extremes, there's drought and heat. This image happened to be from North Dakota, and I include it here because last summer, I was getting calls from producers around the state expressing concern that because of drought and heat happening elsewhere, there's impacts to, say, hay reserves in Nebraska, or moving cattle from one location to another, or culling of herds and those kinds of things happening. So events that happen outside of Nebraska do have an impact here in the state. Or the frequency of heavy rain events, how that is only going to be amplified because of climate change. So I was out a couple of summers ago helping maintain weather stations. This image happens to be from Goodmanson Ranch, and you can see there was a road there, and it is no longer. It was washed out due to a heavy rain event. So these kinds of things, erosion, urban flooding, flash flooding, there's all sorts of implications for heavy rain events. And then finally, something like the flood of 2019, this massive springtime snowmelt flood event where the setup was key in that we had a cold end of winter. We had a very cold February. We had a snowy winter. It was the snowiest winter on record for Lincoln and some other parts of Nebraska. So we had a lot deep frozen ground that was saturated. We had snowpack on top of the ground. And then we had this extreme storm come through in March, and significant and rapid snow melt that happened, lots of river ice. So the setup was there, and then this big storm comes through that results in these very significant and large scale impacts that affect much of Nebraska. So a thing for you to think about is not the question of, did climate change cause this event to happen, but how much worse was this event made because of climate change, okay? Right. And I think I'm going to transition to a slightly different section here. So I'll just pause for a second there and see if there might be any questions on anything that was covered in the previous section.
I don't see any questions so far, Martha. So thank you.
Yeah.
We're just absorbing all the information.
Yeah. I'll keep going here. So that was, in a broad brush view, that's how things have changed, how things will change in the future. And climate change is very nuanced. So there's a lot of different, there's a lot of details that we could dive into. And sometimes the implications really depend on the sector that you're coming from, or the time of year that changes happen, or getting into those details can sometimes really make a difference to your application. But that's, in a broad brush view, that's how things have changed and will change in the future. Some considerations to think about. The climate does vary naturally, and will continue to vary naturally. We can have trends that maybe seem outside of the realm of climate change, or outside of what you think would happen. Not everywhere on the globe will warm at the exact same rate. There will be periods of time where we will actually see cooling. So you see a lot of blue on this map, and we're looking at February of 2021. You may remember February of last year, classes at UNL were canceled for a day or two because of the extreme cold. We had rolling blackouts. Here locally, we had a major winter storm. Nebraska and the Northern Plains have cooled about 5 degrees over the last 30 years. So we seem to have gotten more Arctic air outbreaks in the late winter time period. So this can happen, and climate change can also happen at the same time. So as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, our climate is very complex, and climate change is a very nuanced and complex issue. So we are going to have these trends, again, that may seem outside of what you would think would be normal compared to climate warming. Extreme weather events will happen outside of past expected ranges. So an example of this that comes to mind for me is December of last year. So we had the warmest December on record for Nebraska. We had 30 confirmed tornadoes in the state previous to December 2021. So going back in recorded tornado history, we had 3 tornadoes. And in this one event, which was called the derecho, we had 30 tornadoes. So these kinds of storm events are not typical for a winter month. They're more typical for July and August. So things like this that will happen outside of when we would normally expect them, plan for them, or have resources in place. We're not used to hearing tornado sirens in the month of December. But things like this will happen and should be taken into account because of climate change. So here, this image I took from an article in the Omaha World Herald about the different tornadoes that were spawned from this December event. Okay. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but climate change impacts elsewhere. They also matter here locally. So wildfire risk, that is going to increase in the Western US. Temperatures will be warmer, and conditions in the Western US are generally going to be drier than what they are now. Much of the West is currently in drought now. So wildfires that do happen, that smoke gets brought, it doesn't stay along those political borders, doesn't stay where it happens. So we feel the impacts of this change that is happening in a far off place. So also think about the changes that are happening elsewhere and how that might impact us here locally. Okay. So my last little bit of time here for the presentation, the one thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of social science and communication of climate change. And I understand for a lot of people, this can be difficult to talk about, or people can feel very differently. And maybe that's not the case in your circle. Maybe you all feel kind of the same way and think, why aren't people doing something about this? Or you may be on the other side of the spectrum. But the fact that perceptions do matter when you're having conversations about climate change. And one thing that I've learned as a scientist is that science is not enough. Most of the audiences that I speak with, I really try and understand their views on climate change, how do they feel about it, and then frame the presentation based on how the organization or the person feels about and what they care about. So I find that I often try and appeal to both the heart and the mind, because sometimes it really doesn't matter what sort of images I show to audiences. It can be the best science that there is, but it really won't matter if I can't connect to the person that I'm speaking with. So I'm going to show some results from this Yale project on climate change communication. Some of you may be already familiar with this. They have been polling the US population for, I believe, over a decade. And they have constructed this idea of the 6 Americas, going from alarmed and activist and doing something about climate change all the way to the dismissive. So I'll show you how the US population feels about climate change. There are a number of questions that you can view the results to in this pull down menu. So I'm just showing you a subset of them. And this does, as you can see, go to the county level. It also shows the results from a statewide perspective, as well as congressional district, I think. So nationally, a majority of the US population does think that global warming is happening. So 72%. What's interesting to me is the fact that they use global warming as opposed to using the term climate change. In my presentations, I don't believe I have ever used the term global warming because it's not a positive connotation for that phrase. I always use climate change. Okay, estimated percent of adults is 18, people are 18 older, think global warming will harm future generations. So it's pretty similar. It's about 71%. I think for the state of Nebraska, it's pretty similar. I think it's about 70% think global warming will harm future generations. So maybe relevant to this audience here, percent of adults who think global warming will harm plants and animals. So notice it says will harm plants and animals. So this is more of a future look. Now, so as for the US population, do we think that global warming is mostly caused by human activities? So the national average is 57%. So you can see a lot of the country turn to blue if it's 50% or lower. So if it's less than the majority, then that color is in the blue tones there. So this should be 100%. We know for a fact that yes, it is mostly caused by human activities, but less than half of Nebraskans feel that it is mostly caused by human activities. Do we think that global warming will harm us personally? Most people don't. They don't quite connect global warming, global climate change with them personally, events that they experience. They're not making that connection between what's climate change and then what they experience personally. So to me, there's a big disconnect here. So the reason I show this is a way that we can improve communication strategies. So I think about this a lot when I speak to different audiences here locally, is make it relevant in local to the audience or group of people that you're speaking with. Okay, and then the last one here that I wanted to show is % of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally. We don't on, and I understand why. You know, there are various reasons. We talk about this in my class. I poll the students in my class and we have a discussion about why they don't talk about this among family, among friends. And again, certain circles, it is discussed and talked about, and we talk through solutions, but as a whole, in this country, we don't talk about global warming. So I wanted to kind of transition from there and talk about my experiences across Nebraska, and talk about this issue specifically is communication about climate change. So there's a big list of organizations and people here, and I'm not requesting that you read through all of them, but I'm illustrating the different groups and agencies that have reached out to me or the office that I work with about climate change. Some of these make sense, right? But some of these may surprise you that they're listed on here as wanting to know more about climate change. And I'm happy to talk more in detail with any of you that would like to do so at a later date. But so I'm illustrating here that, you know, and this is a spectrum of over the last couple of years or so. And in my time as state climatologist over 7 years, I've given hundreds of presentations to thousands of people, and have come up with this my own version of these 6 Americas, but it's my 3 Nebraskans, I guess I'll call it. And so I tend to group people into these 3 different bubbles, and these are relative sizes for the bubbles. So there is a harmful group, and there are individuals, there are organizations that are not paying attention to climate change, or they're actively working against those who are trying to work through solutions. So I call them the harmful category. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there's these active participants, and these would be groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, or the students in my classroom, you know, organizations such as this may be reflective of you. That there are many groups that care very strongly about climate change, want to do something about it, are frustrated that action is not being put into place now. And those groups typically ask, you know, how do we communicate with people about this topic? And then probably the biggest group of Nebraskans is, I would put them in this bubble called curious, and maybe they used to be in the harmful category, but when something like the flood of 2019, the tornadoes in December, the wind and dryness and fires this spring, when heavy rain events, when all these weather scale events happen and they impact somebody personally, that tends to shift people from dismissing it to being curious and wanting to know more about it. So I generally place what I think is probably the biggest population of the state in this curious category. So this is kind of my my view of how people in the state are based on my interactions with them. So let's see. Yeah, just a few closing comments here, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. Some things to think about. The magnitude of the expected changes will exceed what we've experienced in the last century. And for some, that may seem very scary. How do we do this? How do we approach this? How do we adapt if it's something that we haven't seen before? And I tend to tell people, think of it as an opportunity for transformational change, or pivoting to a different area, or investing in something different, thinking about our strategies in a different way, because we can't always rely on something that worked in the past, because these rates of change are going to be so high and something we haven't experienced. Then those strategies that worked for the 1980 climate of Nebraska, it's probably not going to work for the 2040 climate of Nebraska. So thinking about transformational change. And in addition, thinking about social and environmental justice in solutions. I realize I didn't cover this topic very strongly today, but one of the first few slides I had brought up this disproportionality of climate change. So how do we think about helping those that are impacted the most? And if we look at climate change from a social and environmental justice perspective, then we can not only tackle climate change, but other aspects, other realities of the society that we live in. So just some closing comments there and some things to consider. So I will, there's my contact information. If you all have an interest in something specific that I talked about or wanted to touch base with me offline, you're welcome to visit our website, send me an email or give me a shout out over the phone, and I'd be happy to talk with you. So I will end there, Amber, and maybe we'll have time for questions.
Yeah, we do have about 5 questions, and there might be some more as we start answering them. But thank you so much for that helpful presentation. A lot of information, a lot of things to think about. I know I've seen you speak before, and as valuable as all the scary information that you shared was, what my biggest takeaway is how you spoke to the perspectives of Nebraskans, because I don't know about you or anyone else, but often it feels like the loudest voices are the majority. And really what my understanding from your presentation has been in the past is that, really focusing on that curious, there's a lot more folks who are curious and wanting to understand more, and having what you had said before is climate change adjacent conversations. I really like that. So thank you for that. Are you ready for questions?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So one of our first ones was from Paula, and she mentioned, can you elaborate on how climate change exasperates the spread of invasive species? And she said, excellent presentation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wish I was an ecologist or had one right here with me. Yeah, so, okay, I'm trying to think of an example that would apply here. In terms of invasive species. So one thing to think about would be survival of pests. So maybe pests that previously could not exist in Nebraska because the climate was too harsh, maybe. But now we're getting warmer, the winters maybe overall aren't quite as cold. These pests don't have the ability to die off. They can survive. And so things are kind of migrating north in a way. So that would be one way in which climate change is shifting conditions so that things can live here that previously were not able to live here. So that would be one example. I also hear something about habitat fragmentation and how that is another stressor. So it's related to climate change, but how that can also cause issues with species as well when there's urbanization or there's conversion of native landscape to cropland that can kind of break up and parcel the landscape. And then you put on this stressor of climate change, and that can really amplify something like this habitat fragmentation.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. That was good. And also the things I've heard in the ecological world is not just the spread, but the impact of them. And so kind of like what you mentioned, a lot of ecosystems or individual species are already stressed from other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Climate change exacerbates the impact of those invasive species. They don't have that full, healthy, their health to be able to mitigate the impact of that. So that's another thing I've heard as well. Another question from Charlene is, what crops should Nebraska farmers be planting with this long range forecast of less rain. And I think I'll also add, because I was curious about this as well, those warmer nights and warmer days as well. You mentioned that in 20 or 40 years, it might be more like Wichita, Kansas. So what are they growing there? Or what does that look like?
That's a great question. Yeah, and kind of a loaded one, I guess it could be. So one thing that I think about it, so if you consider the temperature changes in addition to how our precipitation is going to be different over the course of the year. So I think about something like maybe winter wheat would be much more viable. So kind of small grains, cereal grains, something like that, that is less resource intensive than the traditional corn, soybean would be one consideration. I've also heard or am aware of afforestation, so woody species, and the last question was about invasive species. So think about maybe woody species, or could more fruit trees be grown on land that used to be cropland? Maybe that would be more viable, less risky from year to year, more successful. I think what is important is getting away from kind of a monoculture and diversification. So whatever farming practice is considered, think about you've got not two pieces of pie, you've got lots of pieces in your pie that are helping to support your family.
That's good. Thank you. Gus had a question. He mentioned he's heard descriptions of what meteorologists are calling standing or stationary high-low pressure systems as an explanation for our more frequent extreme downpours. Do you have thoughts on this phenomena?
Yes, so great question. So think about the jet stream. So that is a factor that's tied to climate change. So if I wish I had a whiteboard or something, but if you can think about this sine wave where we've got air that's kind of going up and down, around the globe, we've got this jet stream that's transporting energy. Sometimes it brings high pressure, sometimes it brings a stormy low pressure. Because of climate change, those tend to be locked in place for a longer period of time. So think about even what's happening in the US right now. The West is locked into a drought. In Nebraska, we're kind of on that dividing line, and it's wet in the East. So we have this ridge that's in the West and a trough or stormy pattern that's in the eastern half of the US. So again, this is amplified and partly driven because of climate change. And that's, so I'm thinking of a way to not to get too technical about this, but what drives weather system is a temperature difference on the globe. So think about going from the equator to the pole. When there's a lower temperature difference, the jet stream will tend to be more stationary. It'll have waves in it, but it won't be as active and move around as much. So hopefully that made some sense.
I think so. That was a really nice meteorology 101, really quick explanation. So thank you. And Gus, I hope that answered your question a bit. Let's see. Nancy asked, she's struggling with climate denying colleagues and wondering how they can recognize this information as legitimate and they will take action accordingly. And I know you spoke to that briefly. What's your outlook and thought of how your approach to climate change communication? I know I've heard you in the past say you do have that harmful group, and at this point you're just focusing on the curious because you can move more with them. But how would you help, what would you say to Nancy or anyone else in the natural resource profession specifically who we struggle with that consensus for a lot of folks that we work with, I guess?
Yeah. For me, what's been helpful is if the person or group that I'm talking with trusts me, then, and I am approachable and their friend, then that tends to be helpful. And developing a relationship is probably the most important thing that I can do as a scientist trying to convince somebody that the science that I'm giving them is real. So if there is time to develop that relationship, and maybe you're talking about people that you already have a relationship with, but maybe, stepping back from climate change and talking about, are you a parent? Are you a grandparent? What church do you go to? Or where's your favorite fishing spot? Or do you have asthma? Or finding that issue that is impacted by climate change that they also do care about. So you start with something that isn't controversial, and something that you both care about and can relate to, and starting there, and then just kind of working over time back to climate change. And consider it a process. You're not going to have just one conversation and their mind is instantly going to be changed. I wish that were not I wish that were not the case, but that's the way it goes for some people. So it's a process, and it takes time.
That's excellent. Thank you, Martha. And it kind of makes me think of one of the slides you shared where it said only about 30% of folks are having those conversations. So it sounds to me that I know a lot of us are probably nervous and we don't want to start. We want to still be able to enjoy Thanksgiving dinners, but maybe it's just those little bits over time, lowering our expectations. We're not going to change minds like that, but just being able to have those conversations more often, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Richard asks about why don't people in the field of climate change science talk about the importance of human population control and reducing the increasing numbers of population? I'm sure that's a question that you've had before. How would you speak to a driver of climate change being increased human population?
Yeah, so that's something I bring up in my class, but that's I haven't figured out a great way to approach that to general audiences. Something that I'll share with students is a graphic that illustrates greenhouse gas emissions and based on action. And by far the thing that contributes the most to greenhouse gas emissions is having a child. And I have 2 children biologically. So that's a really tough nut to crack for me. And maybe it's more of a philosophical question. So for me, I have introduced it and talked about it in class. I have not yet found a great way to talk about it with audiences that I feel it won't be received well. Certain audiences, yes, I can, but if it's going to immediately turn somebody off, then I will typically stay away from it until I feel somebody is ready to hear that.
That's really good, and that's kind of a tough one, Martha. So I thought that was a good answer, a good explanation, and kind of wrapping up the answer that you had just had, and also one of our last questions. I'm thinking about, a lot of us feel that, it's just this complex, systematic issue. It feels overwhelming. And I know when humans don't have some kind of personal action, it's almost like you feel this apathy for it. So knowing that it's a systematic thing that needs to change in order to, use those mitigation methods that you spoke of. What can individuals do? What do you speak of with your students when they're feeling that, maybe that anxiety about it? What can individuals do? And that goes with Arlie, the last question from Arlie: how quickly can humans change the effect of major changes of climate change? But really, what can us as individuals do?
Yeah. There are day-to-day things, and they're, paying attention to where do we put our resources and spend our resources? And do we consume lots of things from far off places that are shipped in, for example? Do we buy lots of clothes? Do we drive a gas-powered vehicle a lot? Just kind of, taking stock of your lifestyle and looking at where are you resource intensive and where can you scale back? I think there is, I understand that it does feel overwhelming. I feel very overwhelmed at times, but then there's a high school student that reached out to me because an article was published in the Omaha World Herald that talked about an update to the 2014 climate report that I happen to be leading. And she, a cold call, so to speak, said, how can I help with this effort? So that is by far my biggest motivation, is seeing the youth very concerned and very active. And I feel that I have to be accountable to them. I look at my 8 and 10-year-old kids and think I have to do what I can to create a better world for them. So I understand and feel that it does feel very overwhelming. But again, think of it as a process, and you're not going to shift your entire way of living in tomorrow, and that's okay, but just make it a process and make small changes that leads to bigger changes. Run for office. If this is important enough to you, then run and be the change maker. Be the person in your circle who people look to and see those changes and want to implement them themselves.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And that is really inspiring to hear that comment about the student reaching out to you. And I know, and I've seen a lot and heard a lot from youth who it's like they want to talk about it, and they're around adults who maybe are more hesitant to talk about it, and they're ready. They want to talk about it, and they want to do something about it because it is their future. So I think that's excellent. That's a good source of motivation for myself as well. So any other questions we have for Martha today? We have 1 minute left. This is good. We've got a lot of questions in. Many people said, excellent presentation, very down to earth. So glad I tuned in. Always an inspiration. So lots of people are saying thank you. So thank you for all you contribute to these efforts, and just speaking to this information and sharing these resources with folks is just really impactful. And then just before we leave, I want to let everyone know that I will send an email tomorrow with an evaluation for this particular webinar. I will also send any resources that I heard Martha mention today in her presentation. I'm going to include that as well. And Martha was gracious enough to say she'll include her presentation too. So I'll save it as a PDF and share with you if you guys want more time to kind of process some of that information. And I'll also leave her contact information if you'd like to contact her in the future. But thank you so much for everyone for your participation today, for listening. And again, thank you so much, Martha, for sharing this information with us today.
Thank you. I'm grateful that you're highlighting this topic. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Thank you.